Richard Dawkins is an accomplished biologist, but is more commonly known for his vocal and often aggressive opposition to religious belief. Dawkins is part of a group that's called the New Atheists. The novelty of the New Atheists is more stylistic rather than intellectual, and while this group is often quite feisty, it's not impossible to engage with them and create some space for meaningful conversation and dialogue. If we're secure in what we believe, then perhaps we can be honest about the fact that they do ask some fair questions too. Alistair McGrath, as well as John Lennox, has debated many of the New Atheists and is perhaps as qualified as anyone to offer a lecture on this worldview. He'll break down some of the primary arguments that this group employs and make some suggestions for how we can be prepared to respond to them.
Alistair McGrath really doesn't need much of an introduction, whether you're dealing with theology or apologetics or philosophy. Actually, we are so indebted to Alistair because the original idea to come up with the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics came about with a conversation with Michael Ramsden, Alistair McGrath and myself several years ago. He was teaching at Oxford at that time, went on to King's College, holding a key chair there, and now returned to Oxford University, holding a very prestigious chair in science and religion. He has authored numerous books, has also debated people like Richard Dawkins and others. I think his graduate work was actually in the sciences and biology, and then he went on to historical theology and so on. His books are densely textured, a wealth of information, and anytime I've heard Alistair, I've always wished I could just borrow a little bit of that brain power from him. Does a fantastic job. I'm so grateful that he's part of the team and was willing to give us his valuable time to provide lectures for your benefit.
The term New Atheism was invented in 2006 by a British journalist who was looking around for a snappy slogan to refer to a group of people, including Richard Dawkins, who'd attracted media attention with best-selling popular books advocating atheism. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the ideas of this New Atheism, as these are set out in the works of its four leading representatives, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens. So, how did this movement come into being? On 11 September 2001, a series of coordinated suicide attacks were launched against targets in the United States of America, events now invariably referred to as 9/11. 4 commercial jet passenger airliners were hijacked by Islamic terrorists. 3 were successfully flown into major landmark buildings in Washington and New York, causing massive loss of life. And the impact of these attacks was massive, reflecting a widespread realization that the world had just changed irreversibly. The Dow Jones Index slumped by 7% when Wall Street reopened for business. And public anxiety about the deadly consequences of religious fanaticism reached new levels. Now, in the view of many, 9/11 provided the intellectual and moral launchpad for the New Atheism. Some atheist writers, like Richard Dawkins, have been arguing for years that religion was irrational and dangerous without making much headway. But suddenly, these atheist arguments seem both attractive and culturally plausible. Something or someone had to be blamed for 9/11. Islamic religious fanaticism was an obvious possibility, and in the white heat of anger against this outrage, Islamic religious fanaticism became simplified, first to religious fanaticism and then simply to religion. Dawkins would play a central role in this change in cultural mood in Western liberal circles. He'd already established a reputation as a trenchant advocate of atheism, and 9/11 confirmed everything he'd always believed. Religion was dangerous precisely because it was irrational. Having failed to win any arguments, it had to resort to terror instead. To fill a world with religion or religions of the Abrahamic kind is like littering the streets with loaded guns. Don't be surprised if they're used. Many regarded those comments as dangerously simplistic. Others, however, saw Dawkins as a bold thinker willing to tell the truth. Religion is dangerous. It's not to be respected, but to be feared, and wherever possible, to be neutralized. It's a time bomb just waiting to explode. A loaded gun just waiting to kill people. As Christopher Hitchens put this point with characteristic ferocity a few years later, religion kills. Yes, it's helplessly simplistic, but a lot of people wanted simple answers. And this helps us understand the intellectual shallowness of so much of the New Atheist rhetoric. Now, if the New Atheism wanted to get a debate about religion underway, it certainly succeeded. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk about God. In Great Britain, the influential Economist magazine, having proclaimed the death of God in 2000, found itself obliged to correct itself in 2007. Not a little shamefacedly, its leading article declared that it had been so confident of the Almighty's demise that we published his obituary in our Millennium issue. But no more. Religion was back in public life and in public debate. Now, I and many others have welcomed this debate. The New Atheism has raised questions of fundamental importance, such as the rationality of faith, the relation of religion and science, the possible links between faith and violence, and the place of religion in Western society. And I'm delighted it's now possible to talk about these matters again. For many years they were seen as uninteresting and irrelevant, but not now. The New Atheism has started a most interesting conversation and raised lots of good points. I'm sure they won't mind others joining in and taking the discussion further, because there's lots more that needs to be said. And we must make sure that we can join this conversation and move it on. So let's try to work out what the New Atheism is all about. For a start, it's worth noting that the leading figures of the New Atheism are white, male, and middle class. Yet perhaps more significantly for our purposes in this lecture, its defining characteristic is its anti-theism, an intense anger against belief in God which is held to poison everything. And this helps us to understand the aggressiveness of New Atheism and its tendency to ridicule religious faith rather than engage with it seriously. The journalist Gary Wolfe pointed this out shortly after the movement's appearance. The New Atheism condemns, he noted, not just belief in God, but respect for belief in God. Religion is not only wrong, it's evil. The New Atheism can never rest content with willing full cultural acceptance for atheism. It wants to get rid of religion as well. So religious believers get depicted as potential terrorists, out to get those who disagree with them. People who believe in God are demonized as deluded, dangerous, and unstable faith heads. The primary hallmark of the New Atheism is not its disbelief in God, but its deeper belief that religion, and supremely theism, is evil and irrational, just like the credulous people who believe it. So there's no point, the New Atheism declares, in trying to understand religious faith. The important thing is to get rid of it. Now, most of us would make a distinction between people and their ideas, believing it's possible to debate ideas without debasing the people who hold them. But the New Atheism is out to ridicule both religious ideas and people, the dyed-in-the-wool faith heads, as Richard Dawkins so characteristically and rudely puts it. We've already seen that one of the most characteristic features of New Atheism is its tone, its tendency to ridicule faith. But we need to look at its leading criticisms of religious belief in a little more detail. There are three that stand out in the writings of the movement and which keep coming up in popular debate. And in the remainder of this lecture, we're going to look at each of these and work out how to respond to them. These three leading themes, found in various forms in the writings of New Atheism, are: first, faith leads to violence. Second, faith is irrational. And third, science disproves the existence of God. So let's look at the first of these. Faith leads to violence. The main argument of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, is that religion leads to violence and oppression. Now, this is a good point, and it needs to be taken with the greatest seriousness. As someone who grew up in Northern Ireland, I'm clear that religion can generate violence. But it's not alone in this. Let's be clear about this. We all need to work for the elimination of violence in our increasingly dangerous world. I hate violence of any kind, whether it's political, religious, or racial. But it's hopelessly simplistic to pretend that religion is its sole or even its supreme cause. The answer lies in the reformation of religion, not its enforced elimination. One of the more troubling features of the book The God Delusion is its systematic exclusion of historical memory. We must never forget that the 20th century has shown how political extremism can cause extreme violence. In Latin America, millions of people seem to have disappeared as a result of ruthless campaigns of violence by right-wing politicians and their militias. In Cambodia, Pol Pot eliminated his millions in the name of socialism. And what about the history of the Soviet Union? Lenin regarded the elimination of religion as central to the socialist revolution, and he put in place measures designed to eradicate religious beliefs through the protracted use of violence. Now, one of the greatest tragedies of this dark era in human history was that those who tried to eliminate religious belief through violence and oppression believed that they were justified in doing so. They were accountable to no higher authority than the state. Now, the massive resurgence in religion following the collapse of the former Soviet Union tells us a lot about what happens when you try to suppress it. In one of his more puzzling statements, and there are a lot of these by the way, Richard Dawkins insists that there is not the smallest evidence that atheism systematically influences people to do bad things. Dawkins, I think, is clearly an ivory tower atheist, disconnected from the real and brutal world of the 20th century. Perhaps we need to remind him that the Soviet authorities systematically destroyed and eliminated the vast majority of churches and priests during the period 1918 to 41. And this violence and repression was undertaken in pursuit of an atheist agenda, the elimination of religion. Now, both religion and anti-religion can foster violence. What we all need to work for is the elimination of the extremism that leads people, whether they are religious or anti-religious, to do evil things in the name of their worldview. Any discussion about religious violence must take into account the vitally important point that Christianity offers a rationale for the resistance of violence. One of the most distinctive Christian ideas is that the nature of God is made known in Jesus of Nazareth. The words and actions of Jesus are thus understood to reveal the character and the will of God. For this reason, it's important to note the commitment to non-violence that's characteristic of the teachings and actions of Jesus of Nazareth. He was the object, not the agent of violence. Instead of meeting violence with violence or rage with rage, Christians are asked to turn the other cheek and not to let the sun go down on their anger. Now, I have no doubt that lots of Christians fail to behave like this, but that just shows that they're not good Christians, not that Christianity is bad. Now, the importance of this point can be seen from what has come to be known as the Amish schoolhouse killings of October 2006. A gunman broke into an Amish school in the village of Nickel Mines in Pennsylvania and gunned down a group of schoolgirls, and 5 of those young girls died. The gunman shot himself at the scene, leaving a suicide note that declared that he was filled with so much hate against God. Now, the Amish are a conservative Protestant religious group who repudiate any form of violence on account of their understanding of the absolute moral authority of the person and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. They would do what Jesus would have done. And despite the brutal violence used against the most vulnerable members of their community by a man with a grudge against God, the Amish community urged forgiveness. There will be no violence, no revenge, only the offering of forgiveness. And the gunman's widow later spoke gratefully and movingly of how this provided the healing that she and her 3 children so desperately needed. The cycle of violence was thus broken before it began. It's a tragic story which totally undermines the plausibility of the new atheist critique of religion as intrinsically violent. But we need to move on and consider our second theme. The second point is this: faith is irrational. Now, the new atheism makes rationality one of its core defining characteristics, and it emphatically and aggressively denies the rationality of belief in God. And in a rather colourful passage from a lecture given at the Edinburgh Festival some years ago, Richard Dawkins asserted that religious faith is simply and necessarily a revolt against reason and evidence. Here's what he says: faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. Faith is not allowed to justify itself by argument. Well, I wonder, has he read C.S. Lewis or any Christian apologist for that matter? It's important to realize that the 20th century has seen a new intellectual energy injected into philosophical discussions of the rational and empirical evidence for God, partly catalyzed by new scientific understandings of the origins of the universe. And philosophers of religion like Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburne have reaffirmed the rationality of faith, and they've reinvigorated traditional debates about reasons for belief in God. And there's a growing consensus that belief in God is perfectly rational, unless, of course, you define rationality in terms that deliberately exclude such a belief. Now, there are actually rather few things of importance that can be proved by reason, and God isn't one of them, nor for that matter is anything of ultimate importance. As the great philosopher and intellectual historian Sir Isaiah Berlin pointed out some years ago, human convictions can be grouped together under 3 categories. First, there are those that can be established by empirical observation. Then second, there are those that can be established by logical deduction. And finally, in the third place, there are those that can't be proved in either of these ways. The first 2 categories concern what can be known reliably through the natural sciences on the one hand, and what can be proved through logic and mathematics on the other. But the third category contains the values and ideas that shape human culture and define human existence. In short, the things that give human life reason, direction, and purpose, and which can't be proved either by reason or by science. The truths by which we live, the things that really matter, lie beyond proof. Only shallow truths can be proved. The really important ones have to be accepted and believed. But that doesn't mean abandoning reason. It's simply about recognizing the limits of reason and refusing to allow ourselves to be imprisoned within a bleak and impoverished world of things that reason can prove. The simple fact is that we can't prove any of the truths by which we live. Yet most of us live by these truths without being unduly concerned that they're not proved and are not capable of being proved. When we have good reasons for thinking something is right, we can live on its basis. Well, what sort of things? In 1948, the United Nations reaffirmed their faith in fundamental human rights. The statements of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, from which I've just cited, cannot be proved logically or scientifically. Nor, for that matter, can the belief that democracy is better than fascism or that oppression is evil. You just can't prove these things. But people make them their life's work, believing that they are in the first place right, and in the second, that they're important. As the literary critic Terry Eagleton rightly points out, we hold many beliefs that have no unimpeachably rational justification, but are nonetheless reasonable to entertain. Now let me emphasize that there are excellent reasons for belief in God, and it's important that Christians discover and defend the rationality of faith. There's nothing to be afraid about here. For C.S. Lewis, the Christian faith had a double rationality. It made sense in itself, and it made sense of what we see around us and experience within us. And this basic theme lies behind one of his most famous statements. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So we come to the third of the major themes of the New Atheism, its belief that science has all the answers and can thus dispense with God. So in the third place, we're looking at this idea that science disproves the existence of God. Science is widely regarded as the most secure and reliable form of human knowledge. And it's gained this enviable reputation by the modesty of its ambition. Scientists know that they don't have to comment on everything, just what can be shown to be true by rigorous and testable investigation. Science stands above ethical, political, and religious debates. And it's right to do so. Because if science is hijacked for ideological purposes, as many argue Richard Dawkins has done, its public reputation can only suffer. And we need to remember here that science is a never-ending quest for the best understanding of things. The way things seem today won't be the same in a century. Many scientific theories, though widely supported in their day, have been abandoned by later generations. So science is on a journey. The way it sees things today may not be the way things are seen a century from now. Now, New Atheist websites offer a wonderfully simplistic take on the nature of science. Science proves things, we're told, developing theories that are based only on evidence. Religion, on the other hand, runs away from the evidence. Now, these websites clearly take their cues from Richard Dawkins, who holds that atheism is rational and scientific, whereas religion is irrational and superstitious. Dawkins' argument's been picked up throughout atheist virtual communities. But how reliable is it? Dawkins' view of scientific evidence is expressed in his oft-repeated and confident declaration that if there is good supporting evidence for something, then faith would be superfluous. Dawkins often argues there is no need for faith in science, in that the evidence for a correct conviction compels us to accept its truth. Yet that's a deeply problematic view of the relation of evidence and belief in the natural sciences. Let's give a simple example to make this point clearer. At present, there's a significant debate within cosmology over whether the Big Bang gave rise to a single universe or a series of universes, the so-called multiverse. Now, the evidence is capable of being interpreted in support of each approach. I have many distinguished scientific colleagues who support the former and equally distinguished colleagues who support the latter. But the evidence isn't sufficient to compel the acceptance of either. Both are real options for thinking and informed scientists who make their decisions on the basis of their judgments about how best to interpret the evidence. They believe, but they can't prove, that their interpretation of the theoretical and evidential issues is correct. And that just doesn't fit in at all with Dawkins' simplistic take on things. Science proceeds by inference rather than by the process of deduction that's so characteristic of mathematical proof. A series of observations is accumulated, forcing the deeper question: what must be true if we are to explain what is observed? Or, to put this another way, what big picture of reality offers the best fit to what is actually observed? Now, these sort of things just can't be proved. It's about making a judgment about which theory seems to make most sense of the evidence. Science has to make judgments about what may reasonably be believed to be true, even though it usually can't be proved to be true. Now, there just isn't a problem with this unless you happen to share the new atheist view that faith is some kind of intellectual perversity reserved for deluded religious fools. Finally, we need to note that the relation of science and faith changed decisively in the later 20th century. Although new atheist propagandists regularly declare that scientific advance and progress has eroded the case for belief in God in the last century, the facts are otherwise. The first decades of the 20th century were dominated by a scientific belief in the eternity of the universe. It had always existed, and religious language about creation was just mythological nonsense, which was incompatible with cutting-edge scientific knowledge. But everything has changed since then. During the 1960s, it became increasingly clear that the universe had an origin, the so-called Big Bang. And this idea was met by fierce resistance from some atheist scientists of the day, such as the astrophysicist Fred Hoyle, who was worried that it sounded religious. But the fact remains, the new understanding of the origins of the universe resonates strongly with the Christian doctrine of creation. Two leading philosophers debated this point in 1998. William Lane Craig and the then atheist Antony Flew explored the deeper implications of modern scientific understandings of the origin of the universe. And Craig won this debate, largely because of Flew's difficulties in accounting for the origins of the universe from an atheist perspective. Only God makes sense of the new scientific views about the Big Bang. And Flew gave up on his atheism shortly afterwards, realizing its weakness in the face of the facts. Inconveniently for the new atheism, science here led Flew away from atheism. So it's time to conclude. Many Christians are intimidated by the ferocious rhetoric of the new atheism. They sound so self-confident. Maybe that's because they're right. Well, no, they're not. The new atheism has to use aggressive and bullying rhetoric for the very simple reason that its arguments are so weak. And there is nothing to be afraid of here. The important thing is to know what you believe and why you believe it. The arise and the initial impact of the new atheism made it clear that many churches and individual Christian believers were not paying enough attention to apologetics. It's given us a wake-up call, and it's worked. We've woken up. We've rediscovered the intellectual richness of the Christian vision of reality, which far transcends the pathetic platitudes and slogans of the new atheism. It's no accident. It's on its way out. Its substance simply did not match its bold slogans. People are looking for better answers, and those answers are there just waiting for us to discover them and use them. Thank you so much for listening.